All right, this is the final micro lecture for chapter 11 on muscle tissues. This is going to look at ATP and the three types of muscle tissues. Well, luckily for you, this is kind of long at 28 slides. There's not a lot of things that are going to show up on your exam. So this might be one of those micro lectures that you kind of peruse through. You look for things in red and then you move quickly through it. The reason why this is somewhat long is this is also going to summarize a lot of the things we've already talked about in chapter 11. So if you have a couple of things here or there, some vocab words or some theory that you don't understand, this is a good one to listen to all the way through. So you have two different ways to kind of go through this. Let's get started. So all muscle contractions depend on ATP. ATP supply depends on the availability of oxygen and the organic energy source such as glucose and fatty acids. Glucose is going to be the primarily the energy source that you use. When glucose gets used up, then the body will use fatty acids. And now let's look at the two main pathways for ATP synthesis: anaerobic fermentation and aerobic respiration. These are very, very important, and the first thing you need to know, which one uses oxygen, which one doesn't. Anaerobic, absence of oxygen, no oxygen. Aerobic does. So when you're running down the track, you're running, you're jumping, you're doing, walking upstairs, anything like that, you're using aerobic respiration because you're using oxygen. But anaerobic's a little different. So this enables cells to produce ATP very quickly in the absence of oxygen. It yields very little ATP, and it also has toxic lactic acid and other things that cause it to break down or to damage the tissue after a long time. And lactic acid is the major factor in muscle fatigue. Aerobic produces a lot more ATP. It's less toxic end products because their end products is going to be carbon dioxide and water, but it does require a continual supply of oxygen. So let's look at what's going through your body during a normal exercise or you running on a track. So this is about 60 seconds or about a minute. So first you start aerobic respiration using oxygen from myoglobin because oxygen is already going to be in the tissue, so let's use it. So this is going to be the phosphagen system. We're not really going to go over that, but it starts breaking up a little bit. And the glycogen lactic acid system or aerobic fermentation starts to be used right here. And then when you finish and you start trying to breathe deeply, you're trying to get more oxygen or that repayment of oxygen debt in the tissues. And this is where aerobic respiration supported by cardiopulmonary function. This is just a reason why at the end of a strenuous task, you start to breathe heavily, because at the beginning of that activity, you had oxygen in the tissue. Then during that activity, if you're starting to breathe heavier, that's your body telling you that before that, you were using other systems to create ATP so the muscles can still work. So your short, intense exercise, 100-meter dash, oxygen needed and briefly supplied by myoglobin for a limited amount of aerobic respiration at the onset. But because you're using the oxygen quicker than it can be replenished, muscles meet most of the ATP demand by borrowing phosphate groups from other molecules and transferring them to ADP. That's going to be that phosphate transfer, where you're making ADP into ATP. Two enzyme systems control these phosphate transfers. Myokinase transfers phosphate from one ATP to another, converting it into ATP, and creatine kinase obtains a phosphate from phosphate storage molecules, creatine phosphate. This fast-acting system helps maintain ATP levels while other ATP generating mechanisms are being activated. They're not in red. This is just telling you that there is a step between aerobic and anaerobic. In the phosphagen system, the ATP and the creatine phosphate collectively provides nearly all energy used in short bursts of intense activity. 1 minute of brisk walking, but it's mostly going to be running or jogging at least. 6 seconds of sprinting or fast swimming. This is going to be pretty much if you do 6 seconds of sprinting, 30 seconds or 20 seconds of swimming or sprinting, it's whenever you start breathing heavily at the end. So if you do 6 seconds and you start breathing, you're out of shape. So that's why these numbers are not highlighted. And important activities requiring brief or maximum effort: football, baseball, weightlifting, because you need to do it very, very quick. You see how track really isn't on here. And this is going to be the ATP, AMP, the myokinase borrows one from here, makes ATP into ADP into ATP, and the creatine kinase takes creatine phosphate, makes it into creatine, and then that's taking that extra phosphate from the creatine phosphate and adding it to ADP, making ATP. So that's what's happening there. This can be short-term energy. So then after the phosphate system is exhausted, muscles are going to shift to anaerobic fermentation. And the easiest way for your body to kind of feel this anaerobic fermentation is, do you start feeling your muscles burn? Do you start breathing really heavily? And if you start feeling that, you know you're in anaerobic fermentation. The muscles obtain glucose from the blood and their own stored glycogen. In the absence of oxygen, glycolysis can generate the net gain of 2 ATP for every glucose molecule consumed. So anaerobic fermentation, you gain 2 ATP. That's important to know. That will be tested on your exam. So anaerobic, 2 ATP, net gain. And how does it do it? It does it in the absence of oxygen, and it does something called glycolysis, or it cuts up the glycogen molecule. And it's called the glycogen lactic acid system, the pathway from glycogen to lactic acid. And remember, lactic acid is involved in muscle fatigue, and it produces enough ATP for about 30 to 40 seconds of maximum activity for the normal person. After 40 seconds or so, the respiratory and the cardiovascular systems can catch up, deliver oxygen to the muscles fast enough for aerobic respiration to meet most of the ATP demands. And this is under normal conditions. Now let's contrast it with the use of oxygen. So the use of oxygen is called aerobic respiration, and this produces about 36 ATP per glucose. So if you kind of memorize the two, which one's more efficient? Using oxygen is way more efficient than not using oxygen. And this is a very efficient means of meeting the ATP demands of prolonged exercise. And one's rate of oxygen consumption rises for about 3 to 4 minutes, and the levels off to a steady state, which aerobic ATP production keeps pace with demand, unless you push yourself and go further. But we're not going into these other different cases. So what's muscle fatigue? This is the progressive weakness and loss of contractility from prolonged use of the muscles. Repeated squeezing a rubber ball, sitting, along the wall where you start seeing your muscles start to shake. Holding a textbook out over the level of the floor. It's the same thing where your muscles start to shake. This is going to create muscle fatigue. And fatigue is thought to result from ATP synthesis declines as glycogen is consumed. ATP shortage slows down the sodium and potassium exchange pumps, and it compromises their ability to maintain the resting membrane potential and the excitability of the muscle fibers. Lactic acid is also going to lower the pH of the sarcoplasm. This inhibits enzymes involved in contraction, ATP synthesis, and other aspects of muscle function. So all those things lead to muscle fatigue. Notice how they're not in red. Fatigue is also thought to result from the release of potassium, with each action potential caused and the accumulation of extracellular potassium, and this is also because of the sodium-potassium exchange pump just can't keep up. This hyperpolarizes the cell. It makes the muscle fiber less excitable. The motor neuron fibers use up their acetylcholine, So they can't actually talk to each other anymore because acetylcholine can't be reabsorbed fast enough, put into more vessels to be released. And then the central nervous system, where all the motor commands originate, fatigues by an unknown process. So there's less signal output on the skeletal tip muscles. This happens in a lot of the other sense organs. This happens in the brain a lot, that if you're sending a signal out, eventually that signal kind of loses its potency. They have no idea why this happens. You also have endurance, and this is where you kind of build up. So it's the ability to maintain high intensity exercise for more than 5 to 10 minutes. This is where your doctor would really like to get you to do things for 20 minutes, that 20-minute kind of threshold, where if you exercise 20 minutes a day, your cardiovascular health will be much better, and it's determined in large part by one's maximum oxygen uptake. So you have people who have these masks on when they're running and swimming and doing stuff, and this is just measuring how efficient your body is at using oxygen. So how can people beat fatigue? So you can take oral creatine. It increases levels of creatine phosphate in the muscle tissues. It increases speed of ATP generation. Weightlifting, baseball players used to do this when I was growing up. But the problem is that muscle cramping, electrolyte imbalance, dehydration, water retention, stroke, kidney disease, all these things are really bad because they become really dehydrated, and they cause these muscle fibers from tearing, a bunch of other problems. So taking creatine isn't the best thing. They also had something called carbohydrate loading, where you load your body with carbohydrates so it's available. This will also lead to weight gains and everything else that would be with carbohydrates. So athletes and top-end athletes, they have multiple different things they use now instead of just taking creatine supplements or carbo loading. Now we're going to look at cardiac and smooth muscles. We've looked at muscle. We've looked at the muscle fiber. So now we're going to look at what does a cardiac muscle and a smooth muscle look like. We're going to look at their differences. We're going to explain why these differences are important. And then eventually, if you remember all this stuff, you'll do really good on the heart, which is going to be in AMP2, because that's going to talk about muscle, the cardiac muscle fibers yet again. So let's look at cardiac and smooth right now. So cardiac is only going to be in the heart, and its only function is to pump blood. So every time your heart beats, it's going to be a cardiac muscle fiber doing that. The properties of the cardiac muscle: contracts with a regular rhythm, always does the same rhythm. There's always the same little space between them so they don't become fatigued. The muscle cells of each chamber must contract in unison. So the atrium contracts together, the ventricle then contracts together. And the contractions must last long enough to expel the blood. So they have to be controlled way more than a regular skeletal muscle fiber. They must work when you're sleeping or when you're awake, because if you don't have your heart beating when you're asleep, you'll die. And it also must be resistant to fatigue. So how does it do this? So the one main thing about the muscle fiber, it's got these things called intercalculated discs. So they do look like skeletal muscles because they have stripes. They're shorter and thicker, but they have this one thing called intercalculated discs that are going to be darker lines than just the normal lines. And what that means is, even though it looks like a zebra just like a muscle fiber, these intercalculated discs are going to be these intervals that are going to be much darker, and these are going to be these little gap junctions that allow each myocyte to directly stimulate its neighbor. So if one cell contracts, the ion can go through that gap junction to the next cell, so it doesn't need a nerve impulse to get to it, because that could take too long. So these intercalculated discs on cardiac muscle fibers, this is how the atriums contract together, and then the ventricles contract together. And they're also mechanical, and they keep them from pulling apart. But the main thing is, they allows the ions to flow from cell to cell. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is there, but it's a lot less development. T-tubules are larger, emit supplemental calcium from extracellular fluid. If you damage cardiac muscle fibers, they repair by fibrosis. They don't repair by making new muscle fibers, so it's very different than skeletal. There's little mitosis observed following heart attacks. This is why scar tissue or fibrosis will start to form after a heart attack, and not insignificant amounts to regenerate functional muscle. So if you have a heart attack or death of these cells, they die. They don't grow back. And they can contract without the need of nervous stimulation. They have a built-in pacemaker that rhythmically sets off a wave of electrical excitation. There is an interesting thing about this we'll talk about in AMP2, but pretty much it has these little pacemaker cells that allow sodium to come into the cell. And if sodium comes into the cell, they'll just leak and they'll go close to threshold, then they'll produce an action potential. The only cells that have those little sodium channels in large quantities are these pacemaker cells found in the cells. That allows them that just the passive flow of sodium allows it to create an action potential. And because they're all connected by a gap junction, they all can talk to each other. So it's a really interesting way these cardiac muscle fibers have grown in a way where they can go on their own. They don't need any nervous impulse from the brain. Smooth. The smooth are kind of interesting because the sarcoplasmic reticulum isn't really there, and there's no T-tubules. So the calcium needed for muscle contraction comes from the extracellular fluid by the way of calcium channels in the sarcolemma. So it's just the calcium in the extracellular fluid that allows these smooth muscles to contract. Some smooth muscles lack nerve supply, while others receive autonomic fibers, not somatic motor fibers like in skeletal. You're going to think about autonomic nervous tissues when we talk about the brain. This is going to be the gut. This is going to be the blood vessels, the fight or flight, the rest and digest. This is all going to be in this part of the nervous system. So when we talk about it, you can kind of see that how they're connected. They're not going to be somatic or motor as in skeletal muscles, because if you think skeletal muscles provide movement or motor. They're capable of mitosis and hyperplasia. Injured smooth muscles generates very well. So if you injure a part of the intestines or a blood vessel, they will regenerate pretty well. And the myocyte structure has a fusiform shape. There's only one nucleus located near the middle of the cell, no striations, so smooth muscles are the only ones that do not have stripes. And because they don't have stripes, that's the reason why they're called smooth. The Z discs are absent and replaced by dense bodies. They're a well-ordered array of protein masses in the cytoplasm, and pretty much you can see how they just look very smooth. They have an autonomic nerve fiber that goes to them, and then those can allow the extracellular fluid to go into to make the calcium go into the cell. The smooth muscle is involuntary, just like the cardiac. You don't have control over it. And they can contract without nervous stimulation also. If calcium gets into them, they can contract. So if your body wants to push calcium to one part of the body where there's smooth muscles, they pretty much force the body to contract those smooth muscles. Hormones, carbon dioxide, low pH, oxygen deficiencies, they also allow them to contract. They can also respond to stretch. So if you stretch or you put pressure on an area, they can actually contract them. Single unit smooth muscles in the stomach and intestines have pacemaker cells that set off waves of contraction throughout the entire layer of muscles. That's going to be how you move the food, how you move the nutrients through the digestive system, and all of this is going to be talked about in AMP2. That's why none of it is in red right now. And then we talked about it, the autonomic nervous system. These can trigger and modify contractions. We've also talked about other things that can do it, like stretch, pH, and all these other things. It's either going to be acetylcholine or norepinephrine, but again, most of these are going to be talked about when we do AMP2. A couple of little diseases. We have muscular dystrophy. This is how we're going to end this chapter. And this is a group of hereditary diseases in which skeletal muscles degenerate and weaken and are replaced with fat or fibrous scar tissue. You have Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. It is caused by a sex-linked recessive trait. It's the most common form. It's a disease of males diagnosed between 2 and 10 years of age. It's caused by a gene mutation by muscle protein dystrophin. That's why it's muscular dystrophy. And the actin not linked to sarcolemma and the cell membranes damaged during contraction, then that causes necrosis or scar tissue to result, and this stops them from contracting very, very, very efficiently and smoothly. People rarely live past the age of 20 due to the effect of the respiratory and cardiac muscles. This is incurable because this happens in skeletal and in cardiac muscles. That scar tissue builds up over time, doesn't allow you to breathe, and it doesn't allow your heart to actually pump blood. Myasthenia gravis. This is an autoimmune disease in which antibodies are going to attack the neuromuscular junction and bind to acetylcholine receptors together in clusters. This is highlighted and this is in red because this could show up on your test. And it's important to understand that the immune system can also start to attack itself. And when it starts to attack itself, the body needs to have ways to kind of come up with ways to combat it. So if you think about this one, antibodies are going to attack the neuromuscular junctions. And it's going to attack where the acetylcholine is going to bind. This is the disease of women between 20 and 40. Muscles fibers then remove the cluster of receptors from the sarcoplasma by endocytosis. This means the fiber becomes less and less sensitive to acetylcholine. And because it's less sensitive, the first kind of effects just appear, fatigue, or they start to relax the facial muscles. Drooping eyelids, double visions, difficult swallowing, weakness of the limbs. Also, it causes a strabismus. This is the inability to fixate on the same point with both eyes, where one eye just kind of wanders. In myasthenia gravis, some of the treatments, acetylcholine esterase inhibitors. So if you take away acetylcholine esterase, choline esterase is an enzyme that dissolves acetylcholine. So if you take this away, choline esterase inhibitor, it retards or stops the breakdown of acetylcholine, allowing it to stimulate the muscle longer. That's an important thing to kind of think about. You can use an enzyme that breaks down something else and block it. And if you do that, you can actually allow that neurotransmitter in that synaptic cleft longer and allow that neurotransmitter to work on that muscle or work on that target cell a lot longer. You can also use immunosuppressive agents that suppresses the production of antibodies that destroy the acetylcholine receptors. So it actually targets the immune system to stop them from attacking itself. They can also remove the thymus, and the thymus helps to dampen the overactive immune response that causes the myasthenia gravis. And then the plasmapheresis. It's a technique to remove harmful antibodies from blood plasma, where it almost cleans the blood. And just to kind of look at what these kind of things look like, where somebody tells you to look up and then one of the eyelids starts to droop. It just starts to fall. Because it has muscle fatigue, and this right here is a good way to see, okay, why is this eyelid drooping? It's because the acetylcholine isn't going to be going to those muscles, allowing it to stay open. While this doesn't seem like a very important thing, this happens with a lot of other types of muscles in the body. It can eventually start to damage the respiratory and the heart, but right when it first starts, it's just going to be drooping eyelids for the most part. And that concludes Chapter 11 for your A&P 1. Good luck.